Yes, hi. Welcome everyone to our second event in this series exploring how the media industry has responded to the various public health, economic, and social changes of 2020. So today I have with me three guests. I think that they can put their mic and video on. So the first guest and three preeminent guests of our local community here in Minnesota in nonprofit media organization. So first we have Tanner Curl, who is the executive director of MinnPost. Tanner has been MinnPost executive director since July of this year. Prior to that, he oversaw the growth of the organization fundraising, having served as development director since 2017. Before MinnPost, Tanner worked at the Loft Literary Center, a nonprofit based in Minneapolis, where his focus was on individual giving and events. Tanner has been active in development of nonprofit journalism sector through the Institute of Nonprofit News, and he lives in South Minneapolis, me too, by the way, with his wife, daughter, and cat. I also have a cat, but grew up up north in the farm in northeast Iowa. Second speaker is Meg Martin. She's managing editor at NPR News Enterprise. Meg is an editor in the NPR newsroom where she's worked with for the past 8 years. While 2008 has brought it with many new layers to her role, her primary role is to work with NPR's team of regional journalists based in 6 boroughs across the state and coordinate the newsroom's partnership with news organizations across the region. She's originally from Pittsburgh, and before coming to Minnesota, worked at the Roanoke Times newspaper in Southwest Virginia and the Poynter Institute in Florida. And our third guest is Sylvia Strobel, who's president and CEO of TPT. Sylvia has been a CEO since February 2020, so that's pretty right before the pandemic hit. Prior to TPT PBS, Strobel was the Chief Operating Officer for IdeaStream, where she oversaw management of WVIZ PBS, 90.3 WCPN FM, and WCLV FM, the Ohio Channel and Ohio Government Telecommunications. Before joining IdeaStream, Sylvia served on the executive management team of the American Public Media Group as its senior vice president and general counsel. Prior to APMG, Sylvia served as CEO of the Alliance for Women in the Media in Washington, D.C., president and general manager of the Pennsylvania Public Television Network, and was an attorney for Twin City Public Television and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's a lot of experience we have today on the panel. That's really impressive. So very honored to be moderating this. I'd like to start this conversation by focusing on 2020, how nonprofit news organizations are entering the year and discuss the challenges that it's surmounted both in handling the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent social unrest in Minneapolis. So let's go back to January 2020, or maybe February in the case of Sylvia. Can you tell me about some of your organization's strategic goal for the year? And it's obviously open to anyone. Maybe we can start with Sylvia.
Well, yeah, I can start since I kind of just jumped in and then the pandemic hit and left the office again. TPT was actually just completing a 3-year strategic plan. So one of my, top goals for my 6 months on the job was to get ready to start the process for a new strategic plan. And honestly, we've just continued with a lot of the incredible work that we were already doing, and we've pushed pause for the time being. There's so much that's changing. Actually, a lot of innovation that we've found over the last few months that we didn't know was really possible within our own work. But there's the needs have changed. Our audiences have different expectations from us. So we've pushed pause on strategic planning, really taking an assessment of what our audiences want locally, and realizing that we can do some pretty incredible work while we move forward and take our time to best identify how we use our resources moving forward.
Thanks. What about you, Tanner?
Yeah, in January of this year, MinnPost was really focused on increasing reader loyalty. That's a very key metric for us, is not just having people come to our site, but come back and build a habit, which shows some resonance of our work in their lives and the value they see in our journalism. From a revenue standpoint, we were looking at how do we maintain sort of the diversified revenue set that we have, growing philanthropic revenue, our fundraising, but also our earned revenue through advertising, sponsorship. And obviously the pandemic kind of really blew that up to a certain extent. And then editorially, we were focused on what we assumed would be the biggest story of the year, which is the 2020 election. And it was a big story of the year, and has been and continues to be a big story of the year, but obviously had some other contenders along the way.
So I have a question maybe that's a little more directed to Meg, but again, feel free to just kind of jump in and debate if there's a place for debate. But Meg, can you tell me more about how your organization pivoted since COVID and how different it is from what we know Newsroom used to be run?
Sure. I mean, well, on a practical level, most of us are remote. And I work with as you mentioned, I work with our regional team, which is, scattered across the state in 6 different bureaus. So some of this, like in a lot of ways, we've been working like this for a while. But for many of the rest of our colleagues, we really learned that once you went remote, we really had to kind of lean into the systems and tools that we already had in place. So we were using things like Slack and our radio content management system and Dalit, which is Dalit, and like Zoom and calendars and Google Docs and things like that. And so working remotely has meant for us that I think that our processes are really, really even more important. And we've had to refine them as we go too. And communication has sort of been like the number one thing that we have to kind of get better at every single time. So very quickly we had to sort of focus in on what we really needed to do in terms of processes, how we communicate, how we talk to each other, how we assign stories, that kind of our workflow too in a lot of ways. Which is kind of boring, but it's really critical. But we also have people who are still in the office, so producers, newscasters, and things like that. So their daily lives have changed a lot. I mean, there are very few people in the office. They're social distancing. They're wearing masks all the time when they're there. There's a lot of disinfectant and sanitizer and that kind of thing. And the rest of us are kind of staying away to keep them safe. But then there's also the reporting angle and the reporting and kind of storytelling level, which is, we're an audio medium. So our best stories happen when we are in a place, when we can take you to a place, when we can layer sound and create a scene. And that's, especially now, that's not really an option most of the time. So we've had to get really creative in how we talk to people, how we tell stories, how we connect with people, how you build a rapport and a relationship with the source, who you hadn't encountered before. So there's a lot of different layers, I think, for us in how we're thinking about this moment and how it changes. Our photographers are still out there. And then every time we go on an assignment, when someone goes out, we're really, really deliberate about even just saying, yes, we're going to go out and do that. We've sort of gone through all the options of, is there another way to tell a story? Everyone's got masks. We're having really blunt, direct conversations about what is our plan for going in here, and then having blunt and direct conversations with the people we're covering too. So, so it's been a really fascinating. It's been a very quick change, but it's been a really fascinating shift for us, which I think has actually, while it's been really difficult, it's made us a lot more. I think it's made us a lot more agile, or proven to us that we actually are pretty agile. Yeah.
So I'm curious, actually, just to add to that, do you have an example of a story that you would have not created pre-COVID and that you've created that you're very proud of?
Oh, that's a really good question. There are so many. There are a lot of them. Well, I mean, there are some stories that, that we've had to be okay with phone tape. So in radio, for a lot of times, you kind of you'd want to be there in person. You don't want to just make a call from your desk. And so, we've had to do that and then incorporate sort of elements of storytelling into into the call. So if you're doing a phone call, you might record the entire thing. You might do it as Q&A. You might do something like that. We're working on a story right now where we're talking to people about recording themselves. And so maybe that becomes a radio diary. And maybe that's a way to get at their experience when we really can't be in the place that they are. so we're doing a lot of experimentation in that way, and also experimenting with how we're doing a lot more debriefs, which are conversations on the air between a host and a reporter, and playing with how that works too. We had 2 reporters the other day who did essentially a conversation, which is kind of unusual for 2 reporters to be in conversation with a host about things that have been happening on their beat. It was primarily about policing in Minneapolis and sort of what happened with the Defund the Police movement and where it is and where it's going. And it was a real experiment for us, but it's been sort of another example of how we're trying different ways to get at stories and do storytelling, the storytelling that we really want to do, and it's really engaging for a listener.
Thanks. How does your experience compare, Tanner and Sylvia?
I'd say, similarly, it's like, everybody's remote except for a skeletal crew that are keeping us on the air and our small almanac team. I would also say there are kind of 2 initiatives we've launched also while trying to keep all of our staff safe, because it is really challenging to produce while social distancing. But we launched a 30-minute COVID special back in February after Almanac. That was really, something we had to ramp up quickly. And, it's important to get all of that information out to our audiences. It was very factual based, but, trying to juggle all of that while figuring out the safety protocols of folks in the studio or folks out, out in the field. And then at the same time and continuing, we've been covering a lot of the governor's press briefings and distributing that content through other public media outlets, commercial outlets, and many of the ethnic media outlets. And that is really important information. But again, keeping everybody safe. It sometimes happens quickly, making sure our staff are there, they've got the protective gear, but we're also getting that information out to our audiences. So it has required us to really think on our feet and be very innovative in what we do and think differently about safety.
Along those lines, I mean, very similarly, MinnPost, our specialization is in in-depth coverage. We like to think that we're helping readers sort of take a step back from the sort of fast pace of breaking news. But with stories like these, it requires you to respond very quickly to it. And so when COVID hit, which it felt like it happened slowly but all at once at the same time, looking at, okay, can we do a newsletter? What were our daily briefings following the health department? What will that look like? How does that impact our publication flow and sequencing and processes? And, I think does show in those instances, you can be more nimble and agile maybe than you even thought you could.
And related to that, in what way has audience engagement changed since March? I know that NPR, for example, had a lot of engagement during the state fair, and it didn't happen this year in August, unfortunately.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, it has absolutely shifted, but I think in a lot of ways, people are more engaged with us, maybe even than I remember in the past on a day-to-day basis. Explanation has been a really, really important part of all of this for all of us, because everything is so confusing and it's changing, and the news a week ago was very different from the news today, for instance, or even the guidance and that kind of thing. Sometimes it feels like we're sort of like living the scientific process, which is not really how it's supposed to go usually. We find out afterwards. One example is I have a colleague her name's Sarah Porter. She is astonishingly good at connecting with our audience, with people who are listening and reading, and kind of making people feel seen and heard because she answers their questions. So she's out there soliciting questions, we're using different tools and that kind of a thing, but she does that personally, one-on-one with every single question. So we'll do FAQs anytime there's a new development, like a new mandate or a new rule or something like that, or even just guidance on Thanksgiving. Because that's been, it's an easier way, I think, to get at things, and we're trying to kind of help people navigate all of this. It's one of our big goals. So we're in like constant explainer mode. But Sarah is getting these questions and we're answering them, in published form, but then she's emailing people directly. Every single person gets an email back and says like, hey, thanks for your question. Here's the answer, the excerpt, and here's a couple links to other things. So it's like it's almost like a COVID concierge, so she's been really, that's just one example of sort of how we've been able to engage with people. You know, we're also moving a lot of our in-person events to virtual events, so a lot like this. And I know we're not alone in that, for sure.
We're similarly situated. I mean, for better or worse, there are more people at home right now, so TV viewing has actually gone up. But you know, I think our audiences turn in because they really want news, they want facts, they want information, or they want something that is enjoyable. And so, you know, we've seen, you know, our audiences, you know, are right there with us. But we've been using Zoom, and that's where our events have all moved. All of our live events are done. We won't probably be going back to live events for a long time. And it's a way to reach more people at the same time and get them more engaged with comments and have speakers in different places. And we've just found that's, you know, it's a tool that we're using more and more, and it takes getting used to, but yet I think we've had a better reaction from our audience who've been able to engage with us during this period. They might not have come to a live event.
And I think that'll be important. It's something we're talking about moving forward, you know, knock on wood, hopefully sooner rather than later when we can do live events in person again. How do we keep that element of digital connection to be able to have that reach and keep those elements and that breadth of contact out there?
And I think,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, kind of, you know, building on what Sylvia said, also, I think people tend to be, at least it seems as though people are on social media a lot more and all the time. And I'm also seeing people connecting with individual reporters, with us as an institution, but certainly with individual reporters too, especially on COVID. You know, our lead COVID reporter is tweeting every day, lots of different things, and people are asking her questions in real time that she can then bring. And I know, you know, this is, I'm seeing this sort of across the board too. And I'm sure y'all are experiencing that too in different ways.
A lot of what you all do is dependent on funding, right? So that's the tough question. So have you noticed a change in how foundation are approaching funding, and if so, how have you dealt with those changes? So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we haven't seen a lot of change. I mean, we're certainly in conversations with, you know, major donors, major grant makers. We know that, you know, there's been certainly some short-term priority shifts for more direct service and need. But really trying to get a sense of what some of those funders are looking for moving ahead. I mean, particularly with grant funding, you're usually looking down the road. And we were very fortunate in February, before the pandemic, to have received a grant from the Otto Bremer Trust to really look at disparities. And we've been able to utilize that and have created a new 2-year initiative called Racism Unveiled. You know, as the pandemic wore on and the death of George Floyd, it's really given our team a chance to rethink some of the work that we're doing. And, you know, it just happened that grant came when it did. And so we are really building on that right now. And that's important work.
I've seen more flexibility from grant funders, which is always very much appreciated, particularly, I mean, even just shifting to working from home and remote operations in terms of our reporting and so forth, and being in touch with grant funders and donors. But I think, you know, viewing this in the broad arc of nonprofit news and where funders are in funding journalism, I think has only enhanced where the need is, and that we really are truly providing essential services to the community in terms of being trusted guides through these types of situations.
I actually have a question from Drew Garrett, who that is related to this question that I just asked. So I'm trying to collect the questions in Q&A, but if it relates, I'll just raise it. This one is interesting. How have your fundraising and revenue strategies changed, specifically related to individual membership? And what channel and messaging apps, I think, have been the most effective to grow your membership bases?
Well, for MinnPost, we've seen an increase, thankfully, gratefully, we've seen an increase in philanthropic support from all sources, grant funders, individual donors, and within individual donors at all levels, which I think, again, just shows the resonance and the importance of the work directly impacting people's lives. In terms of channel, we've definitely become much more agile in how and where we ask for that support, just underlining that it is important. It was interesting, particularly in the early days, but we're also mindful that these are difficult economic times. And one of our values is that we make our work widely accessible, no paywall, no subscription. It's available for any or all to read. First rule of fundraising is they don't give if you don't ask, but we want to make sure that ask doesn't imply the pressure that you have to give. And so, working with the messaging around if you're able to, if your budget allows for it, and making sure that it's not a restrictive ask or non-inclusive ask.
Like Tanner, our membership has gone up. And honestly, I do think that's a lot. It's based on, the value of the service we provide. We did take some risks, and we were scheduled to have a pledge drive, which everyone loves. But it was right out the week after George Floyd died, and we canceled the pledge drive. That was just, something we absolutely had to do. And expected, frankly, to take a financial hit, because that's a key driver for membership for us. And our members, continued to renew, got a lot of new members. So we've been really fortunate that we live in a community that, supports us and appreciates the work that we do.
And I have a question from one of our graduate students, Rowan, and and I also had this question. So looking forward, is the pandemic going to influence how you're approaching your strategic plans for 2021? And another question that she has the pandemic influenced, I know we talked about Slack a little bit, but how the staff talk to each other in a day-to-day basis?
Well, I can say, in terms of the question of the strategic plan, we're actually in the process of company-wide working through our next kind of 5-year strategic plan. And what I'm hearing a lot in those conversations, I'm not in all the conversations, but what I'm hearing a lot in those conversations is sort of a kind of a recommitment to our kind of what we're working under right now, which is to to deepen our relationship with our current audience, the people who are coming to us for news already. But then maybe equally as important, or more importantly, to reach more people within the state, to broaden our audience, and to be talking to and serving, which I think is maybe the more important part, people around the state who maybe have not encountered us, who have not heard of us, that kind of a thing, or who maybe think we don't have something for them, but ideally that we can serve them too. So I'm hearing a lot of that kind of being this sort of like companion throughout the day for people in lots of different ways, because at least for our company, it's, we're also talking big picture, like music and news. So we can kind of follow you throughout the day, ideally, or be kind of a part of your day. And from a newsroom perspective, we talk a lot about being, helping people navigate, especially in really complicated times. And this is a really complicated time. So, giving people, helping you encounter other people, places, ideas, situations in Minnesota that you might not otherwise have encountered. And that can be in a lot of ways, kind of explaining what's going on. That's where all the FAQs and the questions come in. And, and also, uncovering the news, breaking news, investigating, analyzing data, that kind of a thing too. So we're sort of recommitting in a lot of ways to all of those things, because we're seeing that they're even more important, and that's what people are coming to us for. And there's a little delight built in there too. I know it all sounds very serious, and it is, but it's also nice to also have a little bit of joy in that too.
I had a colleague say the other day that, because of the pandemic, our audiences have probably leapfrogged 10 years in the use of technology. And so we're trying to really keep that in mind as we look at our strategic plan as to how are we going to be delivering content? How are we going to be producing content? How are we going to be getting, that information out? Because it's not going to be like it was before. And that's a good thing. And, even just doing things like on Zoom, virtually, that's not going to go away. We can reach a much larger audience using some of these new technology tools and continuing to use broadcast and social media and our website. But I would say if we look forward to the strategic plan, we're going to be really looking at all of these new types of channels for distributing content and looking at, which audiences want and need those channels. At the end of the day, it does boil down to accessibility. We're available to everyone. We're going to continue being available to everyone, free over the air, but we certainly, need to be in other places too.
It's interesting in strategic planning conversations we're having as a staff, as a board, there's something about when systems are kind of blown up and where, the way of doing things, you can't do it that way anymore. It provides an opportunity to think differently. And it's terrifying on one hand, but also does present the chance to say, okay, we have to change. How can we build in a new way that is better for our audience and serves our mission more deeply?
And related to that, I have a few questions about civil unrest, diversity, and equality. The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis has launched a local conversation about police brutality and the relationship between citizens and their police department. But within our local community, the issue of how news media cover race, police actions, and broader challenge regarding diversity and equality in journalism have come up. How has your organization thought about these issues, and that is, how best to improve the coverage and represent the community in your work?
Go ahead, Meg.
Sorry, Zoom. Well, I can say, for our newsroom, it's a real priority. We talk a lot about changing the narrative. We were part of a conference a couple years ago for media about that very topic, about changing the narrative. For us, it's certainly a constant evolution and a lot of hard work. And I think at the core of it, it's all built on trust. It's about trust and relationships, and we have to work really hard to earn both. So, for instance, we talk a lot about the language that we use, the way we write about individuals, about communities, about history, that kind of a thing, our approaches to writing about people and communities and history. We revamped our newsroom style guide. We do that every so often. And there was this time around, we put a heavy emphasis on those topics in particular, with a lot of inspiration and kind of consultation from other media organizations, from sources and other newsrooms. But I think the other thing that's happening in our newsroom too is that, we feel like it's really important to not just be thoughtful about the ways we write about people, but also critical that we're having those same conversations about our sources, about the people we, in a breaking news story, who do you pick up the phone and talk to? Who do you invite onto your shows in our magazines and our call-ins and things like that? Because, we know that representation matters in our coverage and in our newsroom, and we're not there yet. Every day we're figuring out how to get there, and it can't happen soon enough. But that's something that we are it's a part of every conversation that we have on a story level and on a big picture level, and the way that we evaluate what we do. So for a long time, we've been covering persistent disparities across the state for years, and we've done that on a high level and on a low level. But we're still doing that. But I think for us too, it's really, really critical that when we're telling stories of joy, and I keep saying that, but really of joy and innovation and of change and of science and of solutions, that we're telling those stories from people in communities all across the state. Mm-hmm. And we have this as media, I feel like in general, we have this uncomfortable, but also, earned reputation in a lot of ways for showing up specifically in communities of color, only when bad things happen. And then go away, and then we come back if something bad happens and expect people to talk to us and trust us. But we're talking a lot about we have to be there for the bad, we got to be there for the good, we've got to be there for the boring, be there for a Tuesday, just a normal, boring Tuesday. And so that's something that we are talking a lot about and trying to do, every day in the way we cover news and deciding what stories to tell. And that sort of thing.
Similarly to NPR, I mean, we're looking at staffing, we're looking at sourcing. Much of what TPT produces is more long form. Even with Almanac, it's a weekly show. So, there's a longer lead time to produce usually, unless something happens on a Friday. We also produce a lot of documentaries. Again, long lead time. So it gives us an opportunity, particularly looking ahead, to really rethink how we're producing programs, who is involved, what stories we're telling. One thing that we have done just recently too is to really reassess what we're calling IDEA: inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, internally, externally, enterprise-wide. And we've just hired a chief inclusion officer who'll be working with us as we look at programming, content, fundraising, every aspect of our business, who our partners are, to really kind of give us charge us to think differently about our business and our community.
Yeah, along the same lines, in our staffing, with our board governance, looking at, how do we recruit, how do we retain and make sure we're truly representative and reflect the community that we serve. On staff, this was before George Floyd, but obviously it added urgency to it in terms of having a cross-organizational team that looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really staking out what are our commitments, what actions are we going to take, and then how are we going to take those actions, and making sure we have the resources and capacity available to do that and continue. It's not a here's a plan and when we'll do it and then it's done and everything's great. It's an ongoing, changing the culture, changing the way we work.
Yeah, and by the way, if you can, please keep your mic open so that people who watch can see you, because when you turn your mic off, you disappear to the audience.
Sorry.
But if you can only, that's okay if you don't want to. But it's related. Can you talk a little bit more specifically, because a lot of local media organizations have been challenged to improve their coverage, but also to diversify their own newsroom, and that's not just unique to Minnesota. And one way that broadcasters have been doing that is with pipeline programs and internships, fellowships. So how do you think that nonprofits are doing in providing opportunities for all?
There's a lot of room for improvement, and I don't know if I don't think it's one of those things where you can say oh, well, it's enough, or something like that. There's no real gauge on that. I think part of it is really looking at what opportunities do we have there that we can enhance. How can we work with funders to make more opportunities available, and bring our entire sort of ecosystem along together in that regard.
Well, I'll just say too, one thing Twin Cities PBS had back in the 1990s when I worked there for the first time was a youth media initiative called Don't Believe the Hype. And it was really innovative. We had a lot of young high school students from, the urban areas of the city that came in, produced programs, learned about our industry. And that went on for 10 seasons. And some of those young people have gone on to do many, many different things, some in media, many not. But that was a potential pipeline for public media to really expose young people to our industry and allow us to learn from young people. And we are getting ready to launch what we're calling Hype 2.0 this next year, to kind of get back to those basics and have young people working with us, because we can learn from each other. But certainly for the future of public media, we've got to be building that pipeline, and that takes intentionality.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that goes for the institutional level, but also on the individual level. I think it's up to all of us in newsrooms to be building relationships with people coming into the field and mentoring and that kind of thing. That's a thing. That's one of the things that I really miss too about being in the office, is that so often you'd have people coming in just to see what it's like. There's not, for public radio, there's not a ton of undergrad programs where you learn specifically how to work in public radio. There are some, obviously, but but I think that's another really important piece of the puzzle, I think, is building those relationships and connecting with people and keeping in touch. We have a couple ways. We have some similar programs. We do this radio camp with 360 Journalism in St. Thomas for high school students, which is really cool. And they, it shows up in lots of different media organizations around the Twin Cities. So that is a great way to connect with younger people kind of coming or interested in coming into the industry. We have a couple interns and fellowships. We have a year-long fellowship that we started a couple years ago in honor of one of our colleagues who passed away. It's been a really lovely opportunity for a new journalist or a person who's new to public radio to kind of rotate around the newsroom and experience different parts of it, and then decide, kind of where you might want to land or where you might want to go next, which has been a really great opportunity. But, as Tanner said too, I would say, for us too, there's no one solution and we're good. I think it's a constant. It's constant work.
And you've also been doing some work with partnership, as I was mentioning earlier in the bio.
Yep.
With
Right.
other
Yes.
organizations.
And in some ways for us, so our partnerships, we have lots of different partnerships. So we have one program where we just call it our News Partners program, where we work with newspapers and public radio stations around the state and region. And we share stories, or we'll partner up on reporting on something, or, during the protests out around the Twin Cities, out, in like Rochester or Bemidji or Moorhead or Fargo, we would partner up with our newsrooms there so that we could cover it collectively. And then actually some of our colleagues too did a really cool experimental Facebook Live broadcast on election night. We couldn't do it in person. So they did this Facebook Live broadcast in partnership with Sahan Journal, which is another nonprofit. And it was a really innovative, thoughtful way to sort of take those 2 hours after the results come in, after polls close, as things are starting to come in, and really look at how the election was playing out, the major issues, the way that people were thinking about the election from communities all across the state. So we've been trying to do lots of different things, and we're sort of now looking at, okay, what do we do next, and how does it, how do we have to change the way that we do things, in part because of the pandemic and the way that everybody's working.
Yeah, and it's very invigorating because it seems like nonprofit is doing well based on their conversation. So it's actually good for students. So what would be your advice for students who are exploring career in journalism and nonprofit organization and who are new to the job market?
I would just say now is a great time to be making outreach.
Yes.
I can't remember if it was Meg or Tanner noted, we've had student interns that unfortunately haven't been able to come into TPT, but we can still do projects. I mean, it can be done remotely. It's also, because we're all on Zoom, if you want to have an informational meeting, learn more, this is a great way just to do it, to be very quick. We've all become accustomed to doing business this way. I would say just make the outreach, get to know people, in the Twin Cities or elsewhere where you have an interest. And another thing that I know even our staff have been participating in are a lot of online conferences. There are no travel fees anymore. And often these online conferences are giving steep discounts to get participants. So you can get to know and meet people in many different ways that probably weren't available before the pandemic.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would say one thing, assuming maybe a good number of the students on here are looking toward that editorial career, but I will put a plug in for the business team and the business side of things, particularly in terms of audience, particularly in terms of, for nonprofit organizations, fundraising. There's a lot of growth potential and a lot that you can bring to the table, and to try to stay open to those types of careers and be nimble in looking at what your career trajectory might be and the needs that are out there in the field.
And I would say too, even if you are thinking editorial, there are so many opportunities, and things are changing so rapidly that who knows what the opportunities are going to look like, or what the possibilities are going to look like in a year. I mean, in 6 months, honestly. I mean, it's so, it's really been astounding to me. I mean, it's, and like, I've been really lucky in that most of the jobs that I've had didn't exist before I had them, which is sort of a testament to sort of the way things change. But I think that's really accelerated. And I would echo what Sylvia said about connecting with people. I mean, seek us out. People want to talk, journalists want to talk about their work, like always. So, you know, if you're interested, we want to talk, like, we'd love to you know, to have you like Zoom into one of our meetings or have a remote coffee or something. Let us connect you to other people who we know who are doing stuff you might be interested in, even if we're not. I will say, especially nonprofit media, I found is a really, really generous space. I mean, you know, whether it's at a virtual conference or just kind of a cold call or email or a, you know, a Twitter DM or whatever, you know, I think it's a really amazing place to be connecting with people who are doing the work. And also there are, I'm finding now too, like there are a ton of Slack channels that exist, or like, you know, where people are talking about anything from like specifically like digital journalism or audio work or being an editor or being a manager or, you know, being a photographer, whatever. There's also listservs, which I rediscovered. I thought listservs went away with like the 90s, but apparently not. And there are a lot of radio listservs now. A lot of Facebook groups where people are having these conversations, even though it's remote. So in some ways, it's almost a better time than ever, as, you know, kind of as Sylvia said, to be connecting with people.
So I'll take questions from the audience. Right now, I don't have any questions. So I'll ask you a question. My final question I like to ask. Is there a question that I should ask that I didn't ask?
Journalism turned on us. That's a really good question.
I have a question. I'd turn back, and this is really to the participants. I mean, you know, whether you're in school or you're someone that consumes news, I mean, how have your own habits and lifestyles changed during the pandemic? And how do you consume news right now? Is it the same way? Is it different, more, less? How do you engage?
That's a question to me?
That's a question that anybody that's participating.
Of course, the answer is more.
I don't know if this, I don't know if I'm eligible to answer this question, but, you know, something that I've thought about for myself, but also thinking about the work that MinnPost does is being overwhelmed by news and what that's like. This is not new to this year. This year has exacerbated it, but, you know, being judicious in that regard, and that, you know, we are vying for people's attention. And how do you do that in a very kind of level-headed, you know, even-keeled way to be that sort of steady guide? Meg, I think you used the word companion, which I kind of like quite a bit. But yeah, I don't have any big takeaway there, but it's something that I think about in terms of trying to gauge where the audience is and taking these very kind of chaotic situations and helping present them in a calm, steady way.
Yeah, that's the thing that comes up for us a lot. And I think we're sort of always trying to kind of cut through that fog. And how do you do that? Because the headlines are flying and it's changing every 5 minutes, and actually a lot faster than every 5 minutes most of the time. But how can we offer that way of presenting news that is steady? I think, you know, I think, Tanner, that's a real challenge. Because if you're presenting a steady thing, you might get lost in all the headlines, you know, in all the fire.
Well, or even how, you know, can we give audiences a break from like the heavy stuff, you know? Meg, I don't know if that's like around finding joy in certain moments, or, you know, I mean, for NPR, maybe it's, I got to switch to classical for a while. Like I just need I need a break, or, you know, so I don't know, maybe it's like, I've got to watch, you know, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, or something like, I don't know, just to get a little bit of a break from things. Or for MinnPost, we think about how can our cultural coverage fit into this, or we even early in the pandemic we did some. Here are ways to take a break from the news and a break from what's going on. Just to some recommendations to help kind of give you just a way to step away from the news for a moment.
Yeah, that's just essential. I mean, and I think, all of our organizations have been, very intentional about providing information in a factual, non-hysterical kind of way, while still finding ways to bring some humor and life and perspective, and joy, to our audiences, because we still are living our lives, and we're just doing it differently. And so you need that balance. And I think all of our organizations are really good at that.
And I think too, I mean, we're obviously doing it primarily for our audiences, but for our teams too, it's nice to be able to tell that story. It's nice to be able to step back and, sit with that person doing that fascinating thing, or, or be able to be the person or the team that's kind of delivering a little bit of that too. Because it's a lot to navigate for journalists too. And so that's a really nice piece of it, I think.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I'm seeing now in the Q&A, one of the participants is mentioning how the media consumption may not have changed, but their engagement has increased considerably with media. Yeah. So you're talking about responsibility. That's an important one. Someone else was also wondering if you three would like to collaborate with each other.
Oh, wow. Put on the spot.
Yes, that wasn't me.
Was it Sylvia? Our teams are meeting next week to talk about collaboration opportunities. So we're ahead of you, attendee.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, I guess that's it. And I really want to thank you all for this, for your candid spirit and sharing with us. So thanks, Tanner, Megan, Sylvia, for your time today. And thanks for everyone who attended the discussion today. This has been a momentous year, and the changes and challenges will continue to happen for this foreseeable future. And I would like to mention that on December 3rd, there's a third event of that series where we'll talk about the continued digital transformation of newsroom. We will have Renee Sanchez, who's editor of the Star Tribune, Lisa Hill, executive director of the Minnesota Newspaper Association, and Mac McKillen, who's president and CEO of multiple companies, including Press Publication, North Star, Minnesota, Sentinel, etc. And Alicia Cohen, who's the director of the Hubbard School, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us today because of prior engagement. Will moderate that webinar. So thank you for your participation. Stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.